Okay.
Welcome again to Caffe, Lena. Thank you very much for finding time in your day to come down here to discuss a really important topic and a great opportunity that I'm going to give you credit right now, Gordon, for creating this opportunity and bringing everybody together to talk about homelessness and solutions to it. So on your tables, you're going to see some little white slips of paper. I'm going to trust that somewhere in a purse or a pocket, you're going to be able to come up with your own pen. But if you don't have one, let me know and I can give you a pen. Those slips of paper are for writing down a question. Write it down anytime it comes to mind. And if you hold it up, I'll keep my eye on things and I'll bring it up to Gordon and he can read the questions. The reason that we're doing it that way rather than having you just speak from your seats is because we're also streaming this event on YouTube and we want to make sure that all of the questions are heard and understood by the online audience. And by the way, hi to all of you watching online. All right, so we're going to get underway and Gordon, I'm just going to turn the mic over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah, and welcome to Caffe, Lena. Welcome all of you out there in video land as well. We are very privileged and honored this afternoon to have a guest here at Caffe Lena, Linda Gibbs. I happen to be connected to her through old professional networks from my days working at the state legislature in Albany with her husband. And so when I found out that she had a new book out about homelessness, and I'd been working with groups that are involved with that work here in the county, I thought what an opportunity to try to get her up here to hold forth and talk about the research that went into that book and her professional experience. She was deputy mayor for housing and such services under Mayor Michael Bloomberg in New York City for about 8 years, and now she is an associate with Bloomberg Associates, the nonprofit organization that the Bloomberg organization runs to assist mayors throughout the world in solving problems that they all have in common. So the book is How 10 Global Cities Take on Homelessness, Innovations That Work. I've read the book. It's very readable, and I'm a lay person in this field, but we will ask Linda to hold forth for some period of time to her comfort factor about the book, and then I'm going to invite a couple of folks up here to join the conversation, and we will welcome questions from the audience, both live audience and the virtual audience later on as we go. So thank you very much, and with that, Linda.
Yay, thank you, Gordon. It's nice to be here. This is like church and school. Everybody sits in the back rows, right? So, so all the folks, all the rest of the crowds that are going to come rushing in for the talk about homelessness on a beautiful Friday afternoon will be forced to sit in the front. But it's great to be here. Also, a big draw was the fact that my parents live here in Saratoga, Tom and Mary Ann Gibbs, who are right here with my sister Terry and her husband Pete, and my dear husband Tom. And so I get to visit with them, so that's an added benefit as well. Let me tell you a little bit about my job, and then I think maybe the book will become more clear, like how this evolved. I spent 30 years in New York City government. I moved to New York after I graduated from law school at SUNY Buffalo, and got into city government immediately, drawn to public service based on, my dad worked for many years in state government, and that was kind of the family trade, the family business. And so working in New York City government, I worked all over the place. But I wound up moving into the social services when then Mayor Giuliani, who had his wits about him at that point in his life, created an independent child welfare agency. There had been a terrible crisis, and the new agency needed somebody who understood the nuts and bolts of city government. And I didn't know anything. I'm not a social worker. I didn't know anything about the delivery of social services. But I went to that agency to help them put together things like, the budget shop and the procurement shop and the IT and the HR and all of that. And then I learned by osmosis about child welfare practice, and wound up becoming the deputy commissioner for policy, and really helping to shape the direction of the agency. I'm giving you the long version of this story for some reason. Let me see if I can. Is it okay? Well, here I'm going to tell you the long version because it's telling. When mayors change in New York, all commissioners get changed. It's just like it's just a tradition. And so when Mayor Giuliani left and Mayor Bloomberg became mayor, I applied to be the child welfare commissioner, and they gave it to the other guy. And then they said, but we can't get anybody that we like to run the homeless agency. Would you do that? We know we liked you. We just like the other guy better. Would you do the homeless agency? So I asked my very good friend Gail Naywith, who's a great advisor. What did she think? Should I take this job? And she says, it's a career ender. Don't do it. So I then proceeded to call and say, okay, I'll do it, right? But it's really interesting. I think they could not. There were lines of people for every agency to competing, multiple strong candidates, and they just could not get anybody to take the homeless services job. And I think I took it because I didn't understand it. I'll be really honest. The commissioner of an agency, at that point, we probably had 30,000 people in shelter in New York City. I'll go on to tell you a little bit about the street count, but we now know about 3,500 people sleeping on the streets. And they put into the commissioner job a person who had no knowledge of homeless services because they didn't have a candidate to take the job. And I think that tells you a little bit about how tough it is to run homeless services as agency heads of nonprofits that are delivering the service, and as heads of the public agencies. It can be pretty thankless from a public point of view. You take all of the criticism, and nobody spends too much time, saying thank you for all of the good work that you do. So speed forward, I spent 4 years there, and then I became the deputy mayor for Health and Human Services. I had almost everything except housing, okay. Which is interesting. But it also included, I actually asked Mayor Bloomberg if when he was offering me the job of Health and Human Services, I said, well, will you also give me corrections, probation, and juvenile justice? Because we know that all of the problems that often land those individuals into, getting arrested, jail and prison, stem from all of the social determinants of health and all of the systemic disparities that happen at a community level. And if I can bring the Health and Human Services services together to support those justice agencies, maybe we can break this cycle. And where that actually emanated from was a long partnership of work that I had done with the Department of Probation in New York City, where we did a data match. We said, come on, all I know is how come the jails keep sending me all these homeless guys, and then the jails are saying, how come all these homeless guys are filling up my beds in my jail? And I'm like, they're the same people. Let's see if we can actually collaborate and figure out how to break this cycle and get them the support that they need. And so based on kind of just that experience, where we actually created the FUSE program, which has now been replicated nationally, we were able to have guys coming out, overwhelmingly guys, coming out, actually prep them while they were serving short sentences to go directly into a sort of supportive housing arrangement. It was kind of a rapid rehousing more than a full-fledged, high quality supportive housing. It was high quality short-term supportive housing. So that kind of really, was opening my eyes to a lot of the interrelationships of homelessness and the justice system, and how they just, spiral downward once you get trapped in that. So I worked 8 years. We're going to use up the entire hour just telling you, you're not going to what about the book? Right? We came here for the book. So when Mike Bloomberg left City Hall, he had a Bloomberg Philanthropies, and I always tell everybody, I have an orange business card. Bloomberg Philanthropies, the people that give away his money, they have a purple business card. If you want money and you get an orange business card, all you're going to get is free advice. I don't have any money, but I have lots of opinions. And so I joined Bloomberg Associates, so it's a pro bono consultancy where we work with mayors internationally. And so it's an interesting model. The mayors, we kind of travel as a pack. There's 8 different disciplines. We have transportation, cultural affairs, economic development, like a whole range of expertise. And the mayor will engage a city, and the mayor will look at the range of expertise, and then the mayor says, well, here, I want to work, in one city, I want to work with transportation, cultural assets, and municipal integrity. Another city will say, so they get to pick from a menu. And so mayors, will say, we want to work on health and human service issues. And overwhelmingly, mayors have asked for support on street homelessness primarily. Just grappling with the problem of street homelessness in their cities. And so it's been an incredible lesson for me going across these cities. I know you've all read the book already, so you know the cities, but I'll tell you the ones that are featured in the book. I'll see if I can remember them all. There's 10, right? Internationally, Athens, Greece, and Paris, France, Bogota, Colombia, Mexico City, Mexico. Now it's interesting. I'll tell you about Edmonton, Canada. There are. What is the player that you put in to win the game?
Gretzky.
No, what was the name of that? What is that? They're the one I recruited.
The draft.
I don't know. Like they're the ones. They're the good students. They're the Ringer. That's it. The Ringer. Thank you. And so in Edmonton, Canada, and then in the U.S., Houston, Nashville, Baltimore, New York, and L.A. And so over the 8 years of our practice, I've moved through these cities individually, many of them overlapping, helping them to respond to the request of that the mayor made to help them understand street homelessness and what they can do about it. They want solutions. Oh, look at this! Everybody say hello to Tom McMahon, my dear husband. Thank you. That's very cool.
Thank you.
So it's interesting. So the thing that struck us over the years, and I have one colleague who works with me at Bloomberg Associates who has become a homeless expert, didn't come in knowing the work, but has become a homeless expert over these years. He's a public health guy. And then a researcher who is a professor at Marist College, who was my associate commissioner for policy and evaluation at Homeless Services. And now he's under contract, he works with us. And then Muzzy Rosenblatt, who is the executive director of BRC, which is a service provider in New York City. And so, and Muzzy just, he was like, oh, if you'll pay, for me to go to Athens and hang out in Athens for a week, you don't have to give me anything else. Just the flight, the hotel, I'll be happy. And so, so the 4 of us have moved through these various cities together, learning and observing. And the commonalities that the cities experienced was the thing to me was the most striking. The issue of street homelessness and homelessness in general is more the same across cities than it is different. It's the same in that there is very, very weak accountability of governmental entities for the issue. Weak to none. So for instance, in, I think New York City, because we have the right to shelter that's been enforced through the courts, there's the mayor clearly has responsibility for dealing with homelessness. But in most places, there is not a statutory responsibility for homelessness. And when there is a statutory responsibility, it is typically for shelter, running the shelters. But very rarely is there any place that has a responsibility for people who are on the street. So the way I think of it is that the issue of homelessness is itself homeless. does not have an agency, a public entity responsible for it. The other thing is just that it's the characteristics of the individuals are overwhelmingly the same. Folks on the street, overwhelmingly male. Overwhelmingly having had some either, recent or substantial history of involvement with the justice system. Mental illness is prevalent, and then either co-occurring substance abuse disorders or substance abuse. But quite frankly, it's in our service, in our experience in most of these jurisdictions, it's co-occurring, and the substance use is also self-medication, dealing with their underlying mental health challenges. And so the challenge about how to deal with that, and this is really, really the tough part. And the book is, the front part of the book, we talk a lot about practices. What does good street engagement look like? What does good shelter look like? What does good supportive housing look like? Like, what are the practice areas of kind of evidence-based interventions that we know work when working with homeless individuals? The back half of the book, in some ways, can be applied to almost any complex issue that exists. In the homeless world, here's how it's experienced. You have an individual. They need urgent medical care. They need mental health treatment. They need substance abuse treatment. They need housing. They need skills and job training. They need a job. And it would be nice if they could, have a family and have some social connections and be happy. And so you basically have to coordinate. If you're saying, okay, now not only do I have one of those people, but I have 500, or what is your street count here in Saratoga? Do you know how many?
It's plus or minus 70 to 100.
Oh, if we could only be
Usually.
Saratoga. Just to let you know, I just talked to Glasgow, Scotland. They had, before COVID, they had a street count of 100-ish, and they are down to 2.
Wow.
2, so it can be done. But she, the woman who runs it's actually a nonprofit that is the lead.
They've got the leaders of the world coming in there pretty soon, too.
Yeah,
so.
it happened during COVID, but yeah, everybody's descending for COP26. Is that the name of it? It's an international environment. So, but they're down to 2, and the story she will tell you is that she was able to get all of those different service systems to the table with her, sitting and talking and planning. And the typical way that people talk about this, which is like the coordinating around what they call a by name list. So you actually have the names of those 100 individuals, and every one of those service providers is chipping in their part of the deal that is necessary to solve each of those 100 individuals' challenges, but then prioritized, so that instead of like a lot of what happens particularly in a uncoordinated service system, is there's a lot of cherry picking, right? You solve the easiest problem first. And so, well, I can get, Tom Gibbs a bed because he's a nice guy and he says thank you, but Mary Ann, forget it. She's a pain in the ass. You're like, oh, I don't want to talk to Mary Ann. Tom, come on over, right? And so by the coordination on the by name lists also allows people to recognize that you really have to help the most in need, and those can often be the most difficult to handle people. And so collectively as a group, you really put your efforts into the most challenging cases. Okay, now I'm going to tell you about the book. No, there's 5 more minutes, and then I actually think it would be a lot more fun just to hear what you guys want to talk about. So what we did, so it was really interesting. So commonalities across all these cities, but then different cities are doing like remarkable things and innovating in interesting ways. And I'd be on the call, with Mexico City, and I'm like, oh, well, you've got to hear what Paris is doing. And then I'd be on with Paris, and I'm like, oh my God, you really have to hear, what LA is doing. Because believe it or not, even though they have 57,000 people on the street, they are doing remarkable things, and I don't know when it's going to build up enough head of esteem that it is going to actually overcome their problem, but there is great stuff and great people everywhere working on stuff. So I started actually kind of doing peer learning among the cities. And then I proposed a week-long retreat for these 10 cities to go together and basically peer workshop new innovations that they were all developing. And so it was a chance for them, a little bit of a retreat, get out of your crazy town place and have some peace of mind and time to work on your issue. And do it with the opportunity to kind of test it out among your peers. So everybody came with their challenge in mind, what they wanted to work on. We gave them like private space and private time, but then also to talk with each other and to present their ideas and have people kick it in the wheels a little bit and see how it works. And it was a great week. Some people went home and implemented, and it's been a success. A couple of people dropped the idea that week. They said, "Oh, you're right. This is crazy. It's not going to work." But they picked up something else. But at the end of the week, one of my colleagues who was there said, at the end of the week, we kind of summed up what we heard from everybody. It was kind of a closing workshop. And my colleague said, "This is really remarkable. You should put this in a book." And at that moment, with a glass of wine in my hand, it sounded like a good idea. And so that's how it came about. I will never write another book. It's a painful process. I like to keep busy with meetings, dragging me through my days. It takes a lot of discipline to write a book.
I thought the book had a cohesiveness to it that was very surprising, considering you had multiple authors. And it had a cohesiveness to it, and it explored the topics in a very, not the way I would have thought it was going to go initially, but it did end up in a very strong place where you're talking about the impact of the refugee crisis and climate and the really global, non-local problems that intersect with homelessness in all these major cities.
Yeah.
We're going to invite a couple people up here to join us in a minute, but I wanted to just have you talk for a second about the importance of data gathering, because I think that outside of the professional cohort that is involved in the agencies that are doing this and the grant writing and all of that, the general public doesn't really think about the data that could be obtained from the homeless people. And you were one of the innovators in that area. What got you to the point where data became something you could do, and how did you make it important?
Interestingly, it was actually my experience in child welfare that made me realize the power of data to kind of inform reform and progress. And if you don't have it, you're working in a vacuum. You don't know whether or not the work that you're doing is having an impact, and you don't even know what your goal is, right? You haven't given yourself like a concrete benchmark, and you don't know whether you're making progress toward that. And so, in child welfare, when we went in there, it was a total disaster, and we just started really trying to measure everything. Now, the interesting thing that happened with homelessness is that nobody thought about, what do we do? How do you measure? How do you know how many people are living on the street? There's not a registry. People don't sign up for that service, right? And so there's no way of knowing how many are on the street. And it drove me absolutely crazy that the advocates, the news would just always go to the advocates who were doing their job. Oh, yes, there's 20, 30, 40, who knows, 50,000 people sleeping on the streets of New York City. And then all my, folks in the agency, they were oh no, that's crazy. There's maybe 1,000. I'm like, well, that doesn't sound right either. But there was no way of knowing. And so we actually learned, it was so relatively easy to measure what was, who was being served and where they were going, because you have rosters of clients. But on the street, not so easy. So we learned from London a methodology that they had just established to do the estimates of the number of people on the street. And this had not been done in the U.S. So we, figured out what London was doing, and then developed a methodology in New York. And it's the funnest thing. I love our street count. And you do it here, on the
pit count.
the point in time, And so if you hate the street count, you can blame me, because we did it in, it was a great collaboration between me as Homeless Services Commissioner and Sean Donovan, who at that point was the Commissioner of Housing Services in New York City. And Sean was a great partner for me. He was really committed to the issues of solving homelessness, and so a number of commissioners. But basically, I won't describe the methodology because I'll use a whole hour just to do that if you get me started. But then, having done that, our first count in New York City showed that there was 3,600 people on the street. And then the advocates are like, oh, they did it wrong, they missed so many people. We actually used, it's very rare for people to use decoys as we do in New York. We had one of our strongest critics, Kim Hopper, who is a professor, a longstanding author on issues of homelessness and a professor at Columbia University. We asked him to be our quality control, and so he used college students. He paid them, I don't know what he paid them, $50, $100, to go out that night and to from midnight until 4 a.m. to sit randomly on street corners throughout New York City. And our count was adjusted based on the percent of the decoys that we found. And so if we found 80% of the decoys, that means we found 80% of the homeless people, and so we had to adjust up by the 20%. With that count, it was really pretty remarkable, because things that I didn't understand that came out of it on this question of data. So for instance, it was the first time that the boroughs, the 5 boroughs of the city had numbers about the number. So we didn't only have the citywide number, we had borough estimates. Staten Island, which said, oh, we don't have a homeless problem. Staten Island had a huge number of homeless people that nobody anticipated, and very different. Living in, it's not a rural county, but there's a lot of green space and a lot of backyards, and it's much more suburban feeling than the other parts of the city. But then everybody had so it was more interesting though. That was the most interesting finding from the count, surprised that we found from the count. Other than the number we were, 3,600 people for a city the size of New York is pretty good. It needs to, it's still 3,600 too many, but then what happened in the subsequent years is the boroughs got really competitive with each other. And the Bronx, bless their soul, knocked it out of the ballpark. They got their street homeless numbers down to 100. Wow. They it started, and I think they were hovering around 1,000, and so they within a few years they just organized their street outreach teams, but it also taught us a lot about that, so that we were able to do a lot of service alignment. We're if you looked at a map of where are the street outreach providers, it was concentric overlapping circles concentrated around Manhattan. Oh, all the homeless are in Manhattan. We get the count, and suddenly we see that there's more homeless outside of Manhattan than inside Manhattan, and so it allowed us to do a reallocation of services to where the need actually was. And a big spotlight on Staten Island. It's come on, guys, this is a real problem in your borough. You've got to step up and deal with it.
Well, that's an interesting insight, because one of the things that I think is, as much as I know about New York City from having worked at the state legislature, it's centralized, but it's a little bit decentralized too, because of the boroughs. So you had the boroughs, in a sense, competing with each other and doing things that a borough president could initiate, I guess, or groups within the borough.
As much as anyone, but it did bring the elected officials in. Yeah. The elected officials, those who wanted to, demonstrate their commitment to tackling the issue, they'd go out and do the street count. Yeah. But it was as much it's interesting, the providers were pretty competitive with each other.
And you had a nice section in the book about, I think it was Houston, that had created a dashboard that sort of brought all of that data into one sort of control center where, entry into the system and management and referring people around, all could be done because you had a database to start with, and then you could actually load the activity on top of that. Is that?
Yeah, yep. And part of, if you can get all of the partners to sit at the same table and enter into the confidentiality agreements that are necessary in order to share the data beyond an individual organization, it allows you to do the shared dashboard. And that by name list is, less, more of a real accountability system, so that you can see if you have the case records in, you know the length of time people have been on the street, your first point of contact by a caseworker, is it 3 months, is it 3 years? You can know the complexity of their needs, and it allows for that kind of prioritization and coordination work to happen. But it also creates the system level accountability, right? And like, so Edmonton, the STAR student, they actually have been doing that, and were able to, get to they've modeled out what was necessary. They're okay. We started up here. Through this collaboration, we've, reduced our homeless population by 45%. Our goal is to get it down to functional 0. So what is necessary in order to do that? Because now you have a sense with all this data about how many people are coming to the street, and sharing with Joanne earlier, in LA they have 57,000 on the street, but if they solved for 57,000, they wouldn't be done because they have 9,000 new people to the street every year. So you've got to deal not only with the point in time count, but also the flow of new people coming in. And then you have to work in a preventive fashion, stop the flow out onto the streets. And so it allows you to create accountability, but also to plan and model. Like, what are the, we got all those guys housed. Now, what do we do about the ones that remain? Is the case composition the same, or is it different? Another huge, I didn't mention this earlier, another huge commonality is the Lgbtqia population. A lot of young people who are pushed out of their homes, particularly, and this is a big issue in Latin America in particular, pushed out of their homes because, rejection of them by their families, and they're on the streets, and they're engaging in really, really risky lifestyles, so so when you look at your case mix, it could be that, as you peel off, like let's solve all these problems, and then you peel off, one set of problems, and then you look harder at what remains, and do we need a different approach? Do we need a different service engagement? Do we need different type of people doing street outreach who might be able to connect more to these folks? And so it also allows that kind of insight. So I don't know how people are able to do this work without that kind of data.
Yeah. I'd like to invite Andy Gilpin and Joanne Jepsen to come up and join us to extend the conversation. Andy is the executive director of Captain Community Human Services, which supports and empowers people of all ages, but particularly young people.
Oh, good. I'm so glad I squeezed that in before you came up.
No, you were right in his wheelhouse a few seconds ago. And Joanne Jepsen is former mayor of Saratoga Springs and has been a lifelong advocate for people in need, and was particularly focused on the Code Blue and street homeless issue in Saratoga during her time as a member of the County Board of Supervisors and as mayor as well. And one of the things we were just sort of touching on has to do, I think, with the decentralization of the management system, where in New York you have a pretty strong city government under the new charter.
In 89.
From 89, yeah. A friend of mine helped to coordinate the writing of it. But you have a little bit of decentralization with the boroughs. Here we have a city of 28 or 9,000 in the middle of a county of over 200,000, and so you have about 23 towns and cities within the county. So you have multiple jurisdictions. Now, an agency like Andy, and He's also co-chair of our COC, our Continuum of Care, so he has a real visibility into what all the other agencies are doing. You know, all of these agencies work on a county or multi-county basis, but they're working with jurisdictions that are, you know, a real variable in the whole equation. Andy?
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And the continuum of care really is the backbone for what we're doing here in our community. Our continuum is a little larger than Saratoga Springs or Saratoga County. It actually includes Saratoga, Warren, Washington, and Hamilton County. But what we do have is a way that the group splits itself so that we have a centrist focus on Saratoga County and then the North Country. But we're all one collaborative working together on the homelessness issue that extends across all kinds of disciplines with domestic violence, veterans, families, youth, working with chronic homeless, substance abuse, everything that you mentioned earlier here. And it just is really a wonderful collaborative of so many different nonprofits and governmental agencies, healthcare providers. We've really grown over the last, I would say, 5 years to be more inclusive, to collaborate a lot more, and really trying to address the issue in a holistic way, seeing the person, the family, the individual, whatever it might be, so that we can provide those services, and taking much of the playbook for what you're talking about earlier as far as point in time count as a reference point, using data as a really good driver for how we look at the issue, what do we need to address, where are the gaps, as much pulling in many of those other, you mentioned municipalities or the city to find out, what services they think that we need from their public service sector, but also developers and understanding the housing market and how that affects and swings the population that we see. And hopefully, all together, we're working in one unified fashion under a strategic plan, which we have recently, I say recently, it's probably 2 or 3 years old now. It felt recent, but we're operating under that and with goals and objectives that try to address each and every one of those. And many of what your things are talking about with street outreach engagement has been very important for us. Finding a way to collaborate with multiple agencies. Right now we have about 5 or 6 agencies actually doing the street outreach work, so that really puts them on the front line of understanding what the issues are that people are facing in the street homeless population. But more importantly, because we're so diverse, we also get a lot in this outlying community, so hotel, motel outreach, other places where people find themselves in the rural environment of Saratoga, Warren, Washington. It really does make a big impact, and for us understanding what those issues are so that we can pivot and move to address those things.
Andy, I said the point in time count in Saratoga Springs was 70 to 100 is a kind of a number I remember, but I think for the whole region that the COC is involved in, it's multiples of that, isn't it?
Yes, I think I don't have the data as much as I probably should right now, but I think it was like last time we did it would have been, the true count would have probably been in 2020 prior to the pandemic, because last year pretty much was a wash. We weren't doing street engagement the same way we would with a survey. You can't just walk up to somebody. We were trying to keep everybody safe. So that was observation only. So I think that we kind of would throw that out. But it's about 180 was people that were in shelter systems and or in street situations.
Right.
Across all of the counties?
Yeah, yeah.
We can do this, come on.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, but again, that point in time count is the point of reference, right? It's the ongoing issues of, and right now, our street outreach folks have an active caseload. So when we get to the by name list, we've always wanted to get there. And that was the impetus to have those street outreach collaboration to get that by name list, because it's so helpful when you talk about people and you talk about individuals, not just, it's a problem. You are actually focusing down and drilling down.
Joanne, your experience in both county government and city government gave you some insights into some of the places where things, sort of fall between the cracks between the different levels of government. You have different political philosophies, and as you do in a lot of upstate counties where you have a city that has a certain outlook and a county that has a different outlook. But maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges you had advocating for Code Blue in that environment.
Well, I think thanks so much for inviting me and for Caffe Lena to help us host this here today. That's That's my other hat. I'm on the board of Caffe, Lena, so I'm really thrilled to be
But
here.
that's not the reason that you're on the
I
stage
know,
right
but
now.
aren't we all staying for the show tonight? We are. No, I don't think I've actually ever been on this stage because I'm always in the audience. But when I was county supervisor, I think the main way that we were interacting with the homeless, which wasn't as nearly as direct as when you're mayor, is through the agency that deals with it and hands out the vouchers to make sure that the Department of Social Services is handing out vouchers to make sure somebody's got a place to stay that night. And there's a whole bunch of hotels in the area that are, Department of Social Services approved, if you will. Which is kind of sad, actually. And I spent a couple of times going into the Department of Social Services with a homeless person, advocating for them when I was supervisor, because I wanted to see what it would be like to go through the system, and it's not easy at all. And it took all day to get very little. And the collaborative services was not happening back then. So I'm so glad that there's a lot of progress on that. I think so in December of 2013, I had just won my first election as mayor of the city, and we had a death on the streets. Nancy Pitts, a woman, died in the very cold night, and I was just horrified. And it just happened that the next morning, I was having a meeting with all the regional mayors who had also just gotten elected, with our congressman to talk about how we were all going to work together. And I walked in and everybody knew, because it was all over the papers, what had just happened. And I said to all the other mayors, do you have a code blue? And they said, yeah, of course we have a code blue. So immediately I started calling, and this is the best part about progress, is collaboration and partnerships. And you broached this subject, but I can't stress that enough. Without nonprofit partners and without the clergy in this city, Code Blue would have never started. And you've got some of the nonprofit partners right here today, including Andy, and he ended up becoming our chair of the Code Blue committee. But within 2 weeks, we were up and running on Christmas Eve in 2013 in St. Peter's auxiliary building right down the street, and it's been a struggle ever since to find a permanent location. We thought we had it at one point, but the NIMBY thing exists in Saratoga Springs too, and that sort of ended that dream. But I think the statutory and the mandates, what you were talking about, does help, because we were operating very effectively, and I come from a fundraising background, and I can tell you, once we announced Code Blue and we opened, I had never seen the checks pour in the way they did. And we needed a nonprofit organization to receive those checks. And so Shelters of Saratoga graciously agreed, and then eventually took the program on, and the program became a part of their structure. With the understanding that all the nonprofits would continue to meet on a regular basis, because I found a couple of magic things happen. The nonprofits working together had never worked so closely together before, but it's not just a single problem of putting somebody up for the night. The other magical thing that happened is Code Blue. The volunteers that appeared, the musicians that appeared, the people that were homeless that came in, built a camaraderie with each other. They built a camaraderie with the staff, with the volunteers, and pretty soon they were getting a trust behind them, and so then they wanted to go to the Shelters of Saratoga and start a program, for instance. There's a percentage, as you can probably confirm, that will never want to be off the streets. But that doesn't mean that we can't try, and we can continue to try. And it takes everyone to work together to do this. And now, with our governor having put an executive order in place as a mandate that as soon as it hits 32 degrees, every city through a DSS program or a city government has to offer a shelter. And so then we started working with our police department. How are we going to do this? We can't force them off the street, but it's the law. We have to get them off the street if it's 32 degrees or less. So that was another collaboration, working with the police department, and they had a whole new job, if you will, of making sure that people were coming into the shelter. And they were building a trust and a relationship with the homeless. And it was something that I had never seen before in this city happen. And now we're looking for a permanent shelter, but also I think more laws would help to ensure that the protection is there and that they're getting all the services they need. And that's what Andy does so well, and you did so well in New York City. And I'm so glad you wrote a book, because now we have that as the resource. But if you're not bringing in health and career opportunities and psychological assistance, then they're probably going to be right back on the street again. So that's the other thing we found, that with Code Blue, it really led to a much more comprehensive plan and a comprehensive structure, which is so helpful for everyone on the street.
I've got a couple of questions here that seem to touch on what I think we call euphemistically coordinated entry. So some of the questions are, well, how do you can't you deal with mental illness before somebody becomes homeless? And what happened to that capability in our system here? Well, we know we closed the big, humongous hospitals 40 years ago, but now we've got those people in prisons and on the street. And then how do we? I mean, you write very well in the book. I learned a lot about how once you've got people into the homeless, into some kind of a shelter, in a housing first model or something like that, then you can start to direct them and refer them to other services that are going to stabilize their lives.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, this whole concept of low threshold. A lot of service providers, and I talk about improving outcomes, and they're like, oh, well, they're just very service resistant. And so the problem is them, because they don't want to accept our services. The pushback on that is that you're not offering services that they're willing to accept. And how do we shift our way of thinking so that we offer pathways and alternatives that will bring them inside, stabilize them, and then engage them. And so and generally this is called low threshold services. And I think it's really interesting, Joanne. When you were talking about the opportunity that Code Blue created, COVID also has been really a remarkable experience across the country. People who were believed hardcore street homeless folks, that's who they are, that they're never going to come in, they accepted hotel rooms.
Right.
Right? In Newark, we're working with them.
Including here.
Right? It's
Yeah.
oh, it turns out we just weren't giving them an offer that they were interested in, right? So that's a little bit of some hard look at yourself and whether the manner in which you're offering services is so rigid, or so, if you set up all the expectations, okay, you can come in, but you got to leave all that crap outside. No, you can't bring your dog. And by the way, you have to be sober starting now. Are you okay with that, right? It's no thank you, right? And so in Newark, they had an encampment of 30 people who had been living near Penn Station in Newark for years, and it was driving the mayor crazy. He's like, just fix it. And I'm like, Sakina Hoyt, a new homeless czar, was appointed, and she's super creative, and she's willing to really, break down, all of the rules. She devised a concept of creating a emergency placement facility. She code blued and COVIDed this issue. She's like, it's Code Blue coming up. We're in COVID. We're not supposed to move people on the street. The whole thing was don't disrupt them, because a lot of the, approach is move the homeless along. And then if you disrupt them enough, maybe they'll finally accept shelter. So, but during COVID, if they don't accept them, then you're not supposed to move them. But Code Blue's coming along, and she's like, what about if we create a a code blue shelter as a village. And so she took repurposed containers and created 30 units, and the entire encampment accepted shelter together. And 85% of them are either in housing or approved for housing vouchers already. You know, so their eligibility, all that. And so not only is it getting them off the street, but it's also moved them, you know, connected and created that trust and that ability to engage and to move to permanency. So the, you know, we created the safe havens in New York, which were, you know, kind of a low barrier. So Muzzy is so funny. He created the safe haven model, and he's like, no curfew. He said, these guys are in bed by 8 o'clock. You know, it's like, but they know that they can go at 2 o'clock. You know, that they can show up at 2 if they want to. And you know, they come. There's no, you can't use on premises, but you don't have to commit to being drug free, right? They're gaining trust, they're engaging in services. It's in many ways, a quicker path to solutions than kind of a clean. Clean. That's a bad word. We have better words now. It's not a clean house. It's a drug-free
Sober house.
A sober house. Yeah.
Sober house.
Yeah.
Okay.
When did you go from numbers to names? When did you start collecting the names of the homeless as a way of tracking them and learning about
It's
their,
pretty recent. You're going to have better history than I will on this.
Yeah, I would think that at least for our continuum, it's probably no more than 2 or 3 years old. Many of it kind of started with what we call coordinated entry. I mean, each program has its own kind of caseload list of people who are working through their processes, but we never had a coordinated, you know, clearinghouse of that kind of list. So I believe it's not that year, and it's less than 5 years old, where we actually really had a cohesive understanding. And so coordinated entry is, and I'll just take 2 minutes on that, it's basically all the agencies working sort of as like, you view it like a bicycle wheel, right? There's spokes that all come to a hub. Each of the spokes is a point of entry. And anybody can present, doesn't matter what their issue is, or, you know, so if it's a domestic violence agency, if a person walks in who is chronic homeless, they'll still get a point of entry to the right resource. So we have a common intake, a common assessment, which then gets people scored to that prioritization you mentioned. So we can look at the most vulnerable people and try to get them housed as quick as possible. Well, that coordinated entry now, by byproduct in our memorandum of understanding, so we could share information, you have a list of names. Take that to the next level with our street outreach, and we have Sybil and her program with RISE, and they have this wonderful set of court advocates, homeless court advocates that join our street outreach team. Again, that just moves to a by name list that you can actually start to work on individuals, and when you work on an individual basis, you're really making progress.
It's one of the worst governmental acronyms ever, the Coordinated Assessment Tool. What is it, VI SPDAT?
Yes.
Who makes up a name that bad?
Yeah, that's bad. That's bad.
And now there's actually a lot of work going on to improve it. It's kind of a very long assessment,
Yeah.
and you sort of size and shape of everything, and trying to use integrated data to inform a better tool that helps you to prioritize those. But
Yeah, and
but-
I'm so glad you brought that up. For us, we looked at that, I believe, 8-page document, like, well, who's going to sit still to do 8 pages just to say, can I get through the door to get in some access to housing? So, another longtime member, Maggie, sitting back there, I think she, from Wellspring, helped us understand that. So we took the VI SPDAT as a model, but we created our own coordinated entry and
awesome.
assessment. Yeah.
Look at Allegheny County.
Okay.
I'll send you.
Allegheny County, which state?
Pennsylvania. Where's there? There's probably 20.
There's one
of
in
them.
western New York.
Oh,
very
yeah,
rural
yeah, yeah.
county.
No,
Right out
Pennsylvania.
near where
This
you
is
went
the
to
home
college.
of Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
They
Okay.
have a really strong integrated data system, and they have done modeling to try to figure out whether or not you can create a better measurement tool, and they've started to use that. So, and maybe they should look at you.
We touched on this a minute ago, sort of inadvertently, but the Housing First philosophy of working with people in need. How did that come about, and how has that worked out?
It's so Sam Simbaris, a great provider, long-term provider of homeless services in New York City, basically started the same concept of low threshold, low barrier. And, it's housing first versus housing ready. And housing ready had been the prevalent model. And housing ready means, Gordon, he's not ready for housing. What he needs is some of our loving care. We got to bring him into shelter. We've got to test him and support him and process all of his life. And we've got to help him, deal with all his demons. We've got to get him drug free and get him a job. And then he'll be housing ready. And Sam rejected that. And he said the thing that homeless people need is a home. And will create a faster path to permanency and all those good lifetime goals if, in fact, we have them. The first step is housing, and then deal with all of the complex needs. And it's really informed services tremendously. There's still a lot of debate. I don't think there's 100% consensus in the community. New York City is big enough for us and many of the cities that I've worked with that you can do kind of housing ready and housing first at the same time. And now they're not either or. It's a blended kind of thing. The reality is that there isn't enough housing assistance to meet all of the need. So in many senses, folks are going to come into shelter, or even when you're engaging them on the street and you're dealing with all those issues before housing, simply because you don't have housing to give them. But increasingly, I think that there's been an acceptance that the faster you get people to housing, the more you normalize their lives, the more you overcome the primary challenge, which is the lack of a safe and stable place to live. And it's informed a lot of other services as well. So I'd actually be really interested in your guys' reaction. Is there a particular point of view here? Go ahead.
I mean, for the continuum, we very much are housing first. That's the way we view it. That's the way we approach all of it with everybody. They are housing ready, whatever way they present to us. We're looking at housing first. I think to Joanne's point earlier, it was very scary with Code Blue to think you're going to have a low barrier, come as you are type program, and you never know what people are going to show up and how they're going to show up. But I think it taught a lot about, you can trust people when they come in, and really helped us kind of springboard into the housing first.
Yeah, I think it would be ideal to do that. It can't always happen because somebody's not ready for that, as you just mentioned. So any way you can get them in. I remember our rules in the beginning with Code Blue were, basically no rules in terms of come as you are, so that we just get them in the door and save their life. I mean, we were basically about saving lives at that point. And, but then there's a couple of programs that the city does offer. One is, I have notes in front of me called, it's the Shelter Plus program, and there's a staff person that's partially employed by HUD to put people into homes. So it's a rental assistance program, but again, that kind of goes with the housing first model. So that's different than Code Blue. So I think as the more resources you have, the better, so that you can tailor what's needed to those particular individuals, depending on where they are in the spectrum of being homeless. I'll never forget when I was serving dinners at Code Blue one night, and this woman was helping me serve dinners too. We had a full house that night. It was a cold winter night. And I said, gosh, thanks so much for volunteering. This is such an important program for us. And she said, no, I'm not a volunteer. I'm a guest here. And she proceeded to tell me her story. So you just never know. And as long as we got them in the door and saved their life with Code Blue, then trying to introduce these other programs, whether it's a rental assistance program or Shelters of Saratoga or something else that we could offer them. So that would be ideal to have housing first, but sometimes it's just about getting them off the street and saving their lives.
Right.
And maybe just the last word to say about that is that the evidence is strong that housing first works.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not as the stickiness of the housing is very successful.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I totally agree with that. We've seen so many people change their lives just purely by getting in somewhere stable, out of crisis, out of chaos, and the transformation is amazing.
Stepping up a few thousand feet in altitude, you have some really strong chapters at the end of the book on impact of climate change and refugee crisis, and that element. I don't know as we're as susceptible to those here in our county as maybe coastal cities
Just wait.
are. Yeah, I know.
It doesn't know what it is yet, but it's coming at you.
It might come, but I wanted to ask if you've done any analysis on the potential impact of the infrastructure program that's being advanced in Congress, on how that might address or augment some of the services that are.
Like modeling how infrastructure will impact homelessness?
Well, infrastructure, child tax credit, the home care and the.
You know, it's so interesting. Yes.
Get up on the mic because the streaming people aren't going to be able to hear you.
Oh,
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. What did I do wrong? Okay. Okay. I think that if you want to go upstream and think about how to prevent homelessness more, most of our prevention services are crisis intervention 5 minutes before homelessness prevention. And those are few and far between and under-resourced, and they're trying to fix big problems when when it's pretty far gone. I think to really solve homelessness in this country and in countries across the world, I think we need much stronger mental health and substance abuse systems that do true preventive services and do not drop people out of the bottom of their systems. And we need justice reform that doesn't criminalize poverty and treat people with arrest and incarceration, where then they get really bad mental health and no substance abuse treatment services. So I think in many, yes, of course, we need affordable housing. Yes, of course, we need rental assistance. That's kind of like common sense, but I really do think that homelessness is the result of very deep failures in those behavioral health services and in the manner in which we provide justice in this country.
I thought one of the really insightful segments in the book, and I keep talking about it, all the great ones, but was the intersection that you discovered between parole and housing in New York City. And I think that's a really strong thing. I have a real interest in the correctional system. I volunteered at a state prison for 7 years, and so I've been watching the guys that I got to know in the prison get out and confront, where am I going to stay? Where am I going to live initially? And then eventually.
How they're barred from public housing.
They
right?
have to live
Criminal
so many
histories,
miles from schools in
right?
some cases.
They're barred from section,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
They're barred geographically,
Yeah,
barred. Their families are fed up with them. They don't, right? They're destabilizing force back into the family oftentimes. Of course, not always, but they're really marginalized. From the day they get out.
Yeah.
There's a lot of no's and not many yeses.
Yeah, you found the intersection there, and you got your parole people working with your housing people, and you found that you were really working with the same people.
Yes,
Which
exactly.
I thought was a great,
that overlap.
great bureaucratic insight that doesn't happen every day.
Well, it was funny because the probation office was one floor above the homeless office, and I met the commissioner the first day I worked, and he's like, "You're busy right now unpacking your boxes, but next week I'm going to take you down to Sophie's Cubana Caffe, and we're gonna have a good sandwich, and we're going to talk about the fact that we have this overlapping population, and can't we do a better job?" So all the credit to him for calling it out and getting us working on it.
Yeah. And a lot of the upstate counties, I think, have very inattentive post-release programs. So for men and women that are coming out of the correctional system, they're trying to keep them from violating their parole conditions, but they're not really dealing with all of their other family and human needs, and housing, of course, is one of them. So,
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I want to. I just was speaking with the head horticulturalist at Brooklyn Bridge Park, so there we are at some event, and I'm like, okay, small talk? What do I talk about? Homelessness. So he contracts with the program in New York City called Ready, Willing, and Able. It's run by the Doe Fund. They cater almost exclusively to, it's a homeless services program, but they cater almost exclusively to individuals with histories of incarceration. They are the give me your recent discharges, that's who we are. And then they contract with organizations for cleaning services around the city. The Men in Blue, if you go to New York to, see a play or something, please come back, we need you. You'll see them around the city with the blue jumpsuits and the thumbs up. He just told me, so I'm telling you this because Brooklyn Bridge Park contracts with Ready, Willing, and Able. He just told me 80% of his full-time staff is hired from that program.
Wow.
So they have the contracts, but now the horticultural program at Brooklyn Bridge Park is now overwhelming people with histories of incarceration.
Right.
And so it's just, it's a welcoming place to go. It's like, think about they're the yes in the sea of no's, right? Of like giving people a place to go, working with them, understanding that it's not going to be an easy path, that it's going to be, failures, more failures than successes before you get to that good place in your life.
Yeah.
But it's great proof that it can work.
Great. That's great.
Yeah, and I think learning from each other too. You mentioned that just by all the different cities that you stayed in, and they're now all learning from each other. And I think that's exactly what we should be doing as well. There were a lot of cities that we looked at, and vice versa. And there's a program like what you described just south of here. And also in Albany County, the sheriff there has taken the old jail and turned it into accommodations for homeless and is housing hundreds. So there's so many different things that we can learn from each other. And there's also, I want to make a comment that the different levels of government working together has such an impact as well. So you brought up the federal government and all they're offering in terms of funding and infrastructure, and how can that affect cities to be able to accommodate their programs better. But then there's the state level too. So you've got HUD on the federal level, and who was extremely involved in Saratoga Springs for a while when we had a regional manager here. And then the Homes and Community Renewal on the state level is also a huge resource, and I counted on them a lot. And in addition to all our nonprofit partners and clergy, and we actually, remember the year we created a HUD summit and invited cities from all over the state to come and participate in a HUD summit right here in Saratoga Springs. And we had a lot of different of these programs on the agenda for that. So it really is important to talk to each other and try to collaborate wherever you can.
Yeah.
Oh, I want to tell one more thing about Brooklyn Bridge Park. What he also told me was that he was frustrated because he had huge turnover. He'd hired these guys, but then they wouldn't stay. This is so funny. He said, then I went on paternity leave, and I had time to sit and think. And I realized what I should do is to hire a social worker on staff to help them to deal with their, whatever challenges. And so that's exactly, he came back from paternity leave. It's exactly what he did. And now he's had incredible what's the opposite of no turnover? Retention. Incredible.
Gretzky.
Yeah. So, and then he said, and then the other thing is everybody else is also going to the social worker to help with but that's so, it's like supportive housing, supportive work,
Yeah.
right? And so that was, and he's a horticulturalist, and he figured that out.
And there's probably a tangent on that to law enforcement as well, because we see that in the law enforcement field, there isn't a social work perspective on a lot of house calls. And so we have a law enforcement approach to a problem that could sometimes be handled better by social work. And I think that idea has been bouncing around the culture now for a couple of years, pretty actively.
At least on the youth perspective, I think that's getting better. And I think on the adult perspective, that is getting better. I
Yeah.
think that most departments are getting a lot of training these days, particularly around domestic violence, mental health. Mobile crisis is another program that's available in Saratoga County and others. So instead of the officer having to try to figure out what to do there and before hospitalization, maybe mobile crisis comes in and can provide de-escalation techniques, talk with, find alternatives. They have resources then. I just know we have a youth shelter for kids under 18, and a large part of our conversations with families and referrals are from that perspective. You know, chaos in the home, responding officer, and or mobile health,
Yeah.
mental health crisis. Call us. Yep, we can give shelter for a while. Let's let everybody de-escalate from this. And normally, we have every year, it's about 85 to 87% of the youth return home to the parent and guardian. So it's just a cooling off. And a lot of times that safe space with any population is important. But we do have resources here that are comparable that I think really make a big difference.
Yeah, but it also is going to add to the public safety budgets to be able to
Right.
incorporate that skill along with the traditional law enforcement. I think we'd like to sort of wrap things up, give you some time to sign some of the books that have been sold, and greet anyone in the audience here. We have a lot of professionals from the region that I know would like to bend your ear for a few minutes.
Fantastic.
But if you'd like to say anything else, otherwise I'd like to really thank you for doing this. I know it was an arm twist on your husband over a cup of coffee, a couple of months ago when you were in town for a family wedding. But I really appreciate you making the effort and carving
Well,
us
I
into your
appreciate
schedule.
I appreciate the invite. I feel in my community, and I thank all of you for the incredible work that you do. It's hard.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yay.
Thank you.
So I know I flew in on two wheels here. 3 points.